In a frost-bitten Vermont hollow, an old farmer, weathered as the barn he leaned against, raised a trembling hand at an auction for a gaunt mare with haunted eyes no one else dared bid on. That single act broke decades of silence, pulling his estranged daughter back across the miles and kindling a spark of hope in a boy who'd forgotten how to dream. Through blizzards, quiet sacrifices, and a midnight parade under starlight, that mare didn't just carry her own frail frame, she bore the weight of a town's redemption. And in the end, a single, tear-stained page in a dusty journal rewrote their story forever. The wind dragged across the Vermont hills, sharp as broken glass. Hank Whitman stood on the porch of his farmhouse, splitting logs in a rhythm that felt more like penance than preparation. Each strike of the axe split through the silence, echoing into the woods of maple trees that lined the ridge. The bucket for sap still hung on the bare trunks, swaying in the gust, though no sweetness dripped this time of year, only the hollow clatter of metal in the wind. Inside the house, the wood stove sat cold. Dust clung to the mantel where his late wife's photograph leaned against the wall, her smile fading with the years. By the door rested her boots, scuffed leather, laces loose, as if she might step into them again. Hank never moved them. He couldn't. Every evening, when he came back from the woods, he would see them waiting, like a reminder of everything he had lost. The town of Sheffield had grown quieter since she died. Neighbors still waved, but Hank rarely waved back. He had learned to keep his words short, his gaze fixed on the ground. Even at 62, with shoulders bent and hair silvering into the winter sky, he carried the look of a man younger but tired, hollowed from the inside. Work was the only thing that kept him moving. Chopping, mending, boiling sap in the sugaring season. Work filled the silence, or at least muffled it, but there were nights the silence pressed too hard. In the dark kitchen, with only the creak of the old clock and the hiss of wind against the eaves, Hank would sit at the table staring at the empty chair across from him. He tried to eat in silence, but food tasted thin without the sound of another spoon. Another laugh. Sometimes he whispered her name, just once, to hear it carried back by the walls. Then he would clear his throat and pretend it hadn't happened. The pastor had visited once, carrying a loaf of bread baked by the women at church. Hank thanked him, but kept the door barely open. The pastor had smiled with kind eyes and said something about sweetness still running in the heart, like maple syrup even after winter. Hank nodded, but he shut the door quickly, leaning against it after. Words like that hurt more than comforted. Sweetness, heart, spring, those were for people who hadn't been left behind. That morning, the cold bit deeper than usual. The air smelled faintly of wood smoke from its neighbor's chimney carried across the fields. Hank adjusted his cap, wiped his palms against his flannel shirt, and set another log on the pile. He told himself it was enough. This rhythm of work, this solitude. He didn't need anyone else. But as the day stretched into pale light and the snow crusted underfoot, he found his truck keys already in hand. The auction barn was opening down by the county road, where farmers gathered for livestock they could no longer feed through winter. He told himself he didn't care, that he was only driving down to see, maybe to pass the hours. Still, he slid into the driver's seat, the old truck coughing to life in a cloud of smoke. The dirt road was rutted with ice, and the tires bumped through the frozen tracks. Hills rolled out white and empty, dotted with red barns and skeletal trees. Hank kept his eyes forward, though memories pressed in at the corners. His wife's hand tucked into his arm on this same road years ago, her laughter ringing when the truck hit a pothole. He gripped the wheel tighter. By the time he reached the barn, the parking lot was crowded with pickups. He stepped inside, the warmth hitting him like a wall, smelling of hay, sweat, and strong coffee. Men in wool caps leaned against rails, women wrapped in coats sat on benches, children chased each other between the aisles. Overhead, string lights glowed yellow against wooden beams. The auctioneer's voice rose and fell like a fiddle tune, fast and relentless, numbers rattling through the air. Cattle shifted in pens, sheep bleated, a goat stamped its foot. Hank found a place at the edge, folding his arms across his chest. He told himself he would stay quiet, that he was here only to watch. Then he saw it. In the far pen, half in shadow, stood a horse unlike the others. Its coat was a faded brown-black, ribs pressing hard against the skin. The mane hung ragged, tangled with burrs. A chain clinked as the animal shifted, eyes darting every time the auctioneer's gavel struck wood. But it wasn't the frailty that caught Hank. It was the eyes themselves. Tired, cloudy, yet holding a flicker, like embers not yet gone cold. The crowd turned away, muttering. "Skin and bones," someone said. "Not worth the feed." Another chuckled, shaking his head. No one lifted a bidding card. The auctioneer's chant faltered. He cleared his throat, tried again, lowering the price. Still, silence. People shuffled, avoided looking at the mare, as if shame might pass to them if they stared too long. Hank's throat tightened. He told himself to stay still, to let it go. He didn't need more mouths to feed. He didn't need more reminders of loss. But his hand was already lifting the card, almost before he knew it. The auctioneer slammed the gavel down. "Sold!" The sound echoed louder than it should have, sharp enough to make the mare flinch. Hank lowered his hand slowly, breath caught in his chest. Around him, heads turned, whispers rising. The old farmer who never spoke, who kept to himself. He had taken the horse no one wanted. Outside, as the sun dipped behind the hills, Hank led the mare toward his trailer. Her hooves clattered against the frozen ground, each step cautious, like she was waiting for a blow. He kept his distance, not reaching too close, only steadying the lead rope. When he finally closed the trailer door, he stood for a long moment, the cold seeping into his bones. He wondered what he had done, why he couldn't have just stayed home with his woodpile and silence. But as he climbed into the truck, the faint sound of the horse shifting inside the trailer followed him, like a presence he hadn't expected. The road home stretched black under the stars. His phone rang, Emma's name glowing on the cracked screen. "Dad?" Her voice sharp, tired. "What did you do?" "I heard. You bought a horse? Are you trying to make things harder for yourself?" Hank gripped the wheel tighter. The headlights caught the edge of snowbanks, flaring white. He opened his mouth, but words tangled in his throat. He almost said he didn't know why. He almost said he couldn't stand to see those eyes turned away. Instead, he muttered, "It's done." The line went silent. Then a sigh. "You never learn, do you?" she whispered, and hung up. The phone slipped onto the seat beside him. Hank drove on, the trailer rattling behind. Through the rearview mirror, he caught a glimpse of the mare's silhouette against the shifting light, head low, body trembling. Something stirred inside him, a mixture of dread and an ache he hadn't felt in years. By the time the truck crested the ridge, the wind had risen again, whistling through the maple trees. Hank pulled into the drive, the porch light casting a dim glow. He stepped out into the cold, the silence of the farm pressing heavy. The horse shifted inside the trailer, hooves scraping against steel. Hank exhaled, long and slow. For the first time in years, the night didn't feel entirely empty. The trailer door creaked as Hank pulled it open. The mare hesitated, her body tense against the night. Steam rose from her nostrils, white in the cold air, as if she were breathing out her own fear. Hank stood back, giving her space. He knew better than to rush an animal that had been passed from hand to hand, unwanted, dismissed as worthless. For a moment, she refused to move, hooves planted in the straw, as though the metal walls were safer than whatever waited outside. Hank didn't coax with words. He rarely used them with people anymore, let alone animals. Instead, he loosened the lead rope, stepped aside, and waited. The only sound was the wind threading through the trees and the distant creak of the barn door on its hinges. Slowly, Ash lowered her head. With one uncertain step, then another, she descended the ramp. Her hooves clattered on the wooden slats before sinking into the frozen mud of the yard. Each movement was cautious, her ears flicking back at the slightest noise, her body shivering under the weight of exhaustion. The farmhouse light threw a narrow beam across the snow, catching her ribs, each one sharply defined. Hank felt a heaviness in his chest, the kind that came not from pity but from recognition. Two lives thinned by the same kind of winter. He tightened his coat, led her toward the old barn. The barn hadn't housed much for years. Dust lingered in the rafters, cobwebs caught the light like fragile lace. He pushed the door wide, the hinges groaning, and led Ash into the stall that once held his wife's Jersey cow. The wood smelled of cedar shavings and thyme. Hank spread fresh straw, his movements rough but careful, like a man trying not to remember he cared. Ash stood stiff, eyes wide, muscles ready to bolt. Hank didn't reach out. Instead, he fetched the blanket folded on the shelf, the wool one his wife had knitted decades ago, edges frayed but warm. For years it had sat untouched, a relic of her hands. Now, without thinking too hard, he draped it across the mare's back. She flinched, legs shifting, but did not pull away. Hank's hand lingered on the fabric, pressed lightly against the warmth of her neck. The tremor in her body traveled into his palm, and for a long moment he simply stood there, letting the contact hold. He hadn't touched another living soul like this in months. The wind rattled the loose boards, reminding him how fragile the barn was. Hank stepped back, leaning against the stall door. His chest felt both lighter and heavier. He wanted to say something, maybe her name, maybe nothing at all, but words stayed locked behind his teeth. Later, in the kitchen, he boiled water for tea and left the mug untouched on the table. His phone lay dark beside it. Emma's voice still echoed in his head. "Are you trying to make things harder for yourself?" He had no answer. Out in the barn, the mare shifted, chains clinking softly against the rail. The sound reached him through the thin walls, steady, alive. Hank glanced toward the window. For the first time in a long while, he didn't feel completely alone. That night, sleep came in fragments. He dreamed of snow melting underfoot, of sap running thick and amber, of footsteps across the porch that weren't his own. Each time he woke, the wind rattled the windows, but beneath it he could hear the faint rhythm of hooves against straw, grounding him like a heartbeat. By morning, The frost had painted the glass in pale feathers. Hank pulled on his boots, the laces stiff, and trudged out to the barn. The air inside was warmer, filled with the musky scent of horse. Ash stood in the corner, head low, watching him with eyes that flickered between fear and something else, something fragile as a candle flame. Hank set down a bucket of water, the surface shimmering in the light that filtered through the slats. He scattered oats, not much, but enough to show he meant no harm. Ash sniffed at it, nostrils flaring, then stepped back. Hunger gnawed at her, but trust was slower than appetite. He leaned on the stall door, arms crossed, saying nothing. Patience was something he had learned in the woods, waiting for sap to flow or fire to catch. Animals weren't so different. If you rushed, you ruined it. If you waited, sometimes the world softened on its own. As the day stretched, Hank repaired the fencing outside, the hammer ringing against nails. Each strike echoed into the hills, mingling with the sounds of the thaw. He caught himself glancing back toward the barn more than once, as if expecting her to vanish. In the afternoon, the phone rang again. Emma. He let it go to voicemail this time. He didn't need another reminder of what she thought of him, or of the distance that had grown between them. Instead, he returned to the barn, carrying the blanket she had worn through the night. He laid it across the rail, letting the familiar scent drift back into the air. Ash lifted her head, ears twitching, nostrils quivering. For a heartbeat, she took one step closer, then stopped. Hank didn't push. He only lowered himself onto the stool by the door, letting the silence between them stretch into something less empty. Outside, the last of the snow began to soften, dripping from the eaves into the mud. The season was turning, slowly, stubbornly, like an old heart learning to beat again. And in that barn, beneath the weight of loss and the hush of wind, a man and a horse who no one else wanted began to share the same air, the same waiting, the same fragile chance at trust. The phone vibrated against the wooden table, a sharp sound in the still kitchen. Hank let it ring twice before he picked up. Emma's voice came through, crisp and edged, as though distance had sharpened it over the years. "Dad, I heard," she began without greeting. "You bought a horse. What are you thinking?" Hank pressed the receiver tighter to his ear, eyes fixed on the frost feathering across the window. In the reflection, he caught the outline of his own face, lined, tired, unwilling to answer. Silence stretched between them until Emma filled it. "You can't just keep doing this," she said, her tone rising. "Hiding from everything real. First after Mom, now this. A horse? Do you think feeding another mouth will bring her back?" Hank swallowed hard. The words hit like stones against glass, each one cracking something inside. He wanted to say he hadn't thought at all, that it was only the look in the mare's eyes, but he couldn't find the shape of the truth in words. Instead, he said, "It's mine to take care of. That's all." Emma's sigh was sharp, almost a scoff. "You've always been like this, burying yourself in chores, in animals, in trees, but never once letting people in, not even me." Her accusation lingered, heavier than the wind outside. Hank thought of the barn, of the horse standing alone beneath the rafters. He thought of Emma's childhood voice echoing through these same halls, the laughter that used to fill the kitchen. Now, only the hum of the refrigerator answered her. "Emma," he managed, his throat dry. "It's not." But the line clicked dead before he could finish. He set the phone down slowly, the weight of her absence pressing harder than her words. For a long moment he stayed at the table, staring at the mug of tea gone cold. Outside, the snow was softening under the first breath of thaw, dripping steadily from the eaves. Later, he stepped back into the barn. Ash lifted her head when he entered, ears twitching. Her eyes held the same wariness Emma's had carried, distrust edged with disappointment. He leaned against the stall, feeling the strange mirror between daughter and horse, both circling the edges of his silence. The mare shifted her hooves, chains clinking lightly against the wood. Hank loosened them, letting her stand without the scrape of iron. She turned her head slightly, watching him, but did not move closer. That, he thought, was trust enough for now. In the following days, his world narrowed to the rhythm of caring for Ash. He rose with the gray dawn, carried water that steamed against the cold, brushed her coat with slow, steady strokes. Each motion was a conversation without words. She began to eat, cautiously, her ribs still sharp, but her eyes a little less dull. Emma didn't call again. Her silence stretched longer than the phone line could carry. Hank told himself it was fine, that he had work enough. But each night, when he returned to the empty kitchen, her words echoed in the corners. Never letting people in. Not even me. One evening, while checking the fence line, Hank noticed a figure near the edge of the property. A boy, no more than 10, lingered by the rails. His breath puffed white in the air, hands jammed in oversized sleeves. The boy didn't speak, only stared at the barn where Ash stood. Hank gave a brief nod, not expecting an answer. The boy slipped away silently into the dusk. Later, Hank learned his name. Caleb, the neighbor's son, the one who rarely spoke since the storm that had taken their roof. Back in the barn, Ash pressed her nose against the blanket draped over the rail. Hank watched the small movement, so subtle it could have been missed. A touch of curiosity, a willingness to approach. He let his hand fall near, not reaching, only waiting. She stayed close enough that he could feel her breath against his knuckles. It wasn't forgiveness. Not from her, not from Emma. But it was something. That night, as Hank lay awake listening to the rafters creak, he realized the house no longer felt as empty as before. The mare's presence filled a silence that had once been unbearable. Yet Emma's words still clung to him, a reminder that some wounds needed more than a horse's quiet company to heal. In the dark, he whispered into the still air, not sure if it was to his daughter, his wife, or himself. I don't know how else to be. The wind carried his words away, leaving only the steady sound of Ash shifting in her stall. Alive. Waiting. The days lengthened by minutes, but winter still clung stubbornly to the hills. The mornings broke in gray light, the kind that blurred trees into shadows and made breath visible in the air. Hank rose each dawn, not from rest, but from habit, his body moving before his mind had caught up. He brewed coffee, left it half-finished on the counter, and pulled on his boots with the quiet resolve of a man who had lived this rhythm for too long. In the barn, Ash lifted her head at his entrance. The mare no longer flinched at every creak of the door, though her eyes remained sharp, watching his every move. Her ribs still pressed against her skin, but there was more steadiness in her stance now, as if the earth beneath her hooves belonged to her again. Hank carried the wool blanket folded across his arm. It smelled faintly of cedar from the trunk where it had been kept, and beneath that, a memory, the scent of his wife's hands after she pulled it from the loom, warm and threaded with lanolin. He had not touched it in years. Laying it on the mare's back felt like laying a piece of the past onto the fragile present. Ash startled at first, muscles tensing, hooves shifting against the straw. Hank murmured something low. Not words exactly, but a tone that belonged more to the woods than to human speech. Slowly, he eased the fabric across her spine. The blanket settled, heavy and warm. Ash stood still, her ears flicking, her breath clouding in small bursts. Hank let his palm rest on the coarse wool, feeling the tremor of her body beneath. It was not acceptance, not yet, but neither was it rejection. For him, that was enough. That evening, as the light thinned to gold across the maples, Hank sat on the stool inside the stall, the blanket draped between them. He watched Ash lower her head to the oats, chewing with slow care. He found himself speaking aloud, not to her, not even to himself, but to the space between. "Your mother used to sit right there," he said softly, nodding to the corner of the barn. "She'd hum when the cows came in. Said it kept them calm." Ash kept chewing, ears flicking as if the sound mattered. Hank's voice wavered, rough with the disuse of confession. "I never learned how to hum," he admitted. "Just work, chop, boil, fix. She had the songs." The words settled into the rafters like dust motes, unchallenged, unjudged. Hank closed his eyes for a moment, letting the silence absorb them. When he opened them again, Ash had stepped closer, her breath brushing his sleeve. He didn't reach out. He simply sat there, letting her choose the distance. The next morning, the boy returned. Caleb, small against the wooden rails, stood with a branch in hand, a thin offering of apple buds. He didn't speak, only extended the twig toward Ash. The mare sniffed, ears twitching, then backed away. Caleb's face fell, but he stayed rooted, patient in a way only children could be. Hank watched from the stall. He recognized the look on the boy's face, the ache of wanting to be seen, and the sting of being turned from. He considered stepping forward, telling Caleb it would take time, but the words never formed. Instead, he simply gave a small nod of acknowledgement. Caleb dropped the branch and disappeared into the trees. That night, Hank found the branch lying in the straw. Ash had nudged it, teeth marks visible along the bark. He bent to pick it up, turning it in his hand. Something in his chest shifted, small, but real. The following day, Hank carried the blanket into the barn once more. Ash watched him, wary but not retreating. He spread it over the rail this time, not draping it across her. She stepped closer, muzzle brushing the fabric. Her nostrils flared, taking in its scent. Hank held still, breath tight, until she let out a low sigh and lowered her head. For the first time, she leaned just enough for his hand to graze her cheek. A fleeting touch, lighter than a shadow, but it burned into his palm as though he had touched fire. He drew his hand back slowly, heart thudding in his chest. Later that evening, as the horizon faded into blue, Hank sat by the stove with the blanket folded across his lap. His fingers traced the frayed edges, remembering his wife's hands guiding the threads. He thought of Emma's sharp words, of Caleb's silent offering, of Ash's cautious step forward. Each one was a fragment, separate but circling the same truth. Life only moved when one dared to open their hand. In the barn, Ash shifted, the chain clinking softly. The sound no longer felt like loneliness. It felt like presence. Hank lifted his head toward the window, the first star breaking through the dusk, and for the first time in years, he whispered into the dark, "Thank you." Not to the star, not to the silence, to the fragile heartbeat of trust beginning in the stall outside. The frost had begun to ease, though morning still carried the bite of winter. Each day Hank walked the fence line, boots sinking into the softening ground, hammer hanging from his belt. He told himself the repairs mattered, that keeping the board straight and strong was work worth doing. But more often than not, his eyes drifted toward the barn where Ash waited, her dark shape moving faintly against the slats. On a pale afternoon, the sky low and colorless, Hank noticed a small figure standing by the fence again. Caleb. The boy's shoulders hunched beneath a jacket too large, his hands buried deep in the sleeves. This time he wasn't empty-handed. Clutched in his grip was another branch, freshly broken from one of the apple trees near the lane. Its buds were still closed, tight with the promise of spring. Hank leaned against the rail, watching in silence. Caleb didn't glance his way. The boy lifted the branch slowly, extending it toward the mare, inside the stall. Ash raised her head, ears pricked, nostrils flaring. She took one step, then another, hooves crunching straw. For a breathless moment, Hank thought she might accept the offering, but just as her nose neared the buds, a loose board creaked overhead. Ash jolted, jaw, eyes wide, and retreated to the corner. The branch hung in the air between them. Unclaimed. Caleb's face fell. He lowered his hand, his small shoulders sagging under a weight Hank recognized too well, the ache of rejection that had nothing to do with intention, everything to do with fear. The boy turned, slipping back toward the lane. Hank could have called out, could have told him to try again another day. But the words caught in his throat, snagged on the same silence that had cost him so much already. By the time he found his voice, Caleb was gone, the apple branch left leaning against the rail. That evening, while mucking the stall, Hank found the branch on the straw. Ash had nudged it some time after, her teeth marks faint but visible along the bark. Hank lifted it carefully, tracing the grooves. It was proof of something invisible, but real. Trust didn't come when asked, but in its own slow rhythm, like sap rising unseen inside the maple. He propped the branch on the inside ledge of the stall. The mare eyed it, nostrils twitching, but did not shy away this time. Hank sat on the stool, letting the quiet stretch. He thought of Caleb, of the boy's wordless persistence. There was a mirror in him, too, a reflection of a silence Hank had lived in for years. The next day, Caleb returned, though he stayed farther back, half hidden by the fence post. He didn't bring a branch. He only watched as Hank brushed the mare, his movements steady, the blanket folded across the rail. Hank pretended not to notice the boy, though every motion carried an unspoken message. See? She can be touched. She can learn. Ash shifted under the brush, ears twitching but body calmer than before. Dust rose from her coat, catching the late sun in golden motes. When Hank paused, the mare turned her head slightly, eyes meeting his. It was only a moment, but enough to leave him still inside. He heard the faint crunch of snow as Caleb stepped closer to the fence. Not much, just one pace, but Hank caught it, the sound of a child daring more than his fear allowed. He did not turn, did not break the spell. By dusk, Caleb was gone again. but his presence lingered, like the scent of apple buds after rain. Hank carried the blanket back into the house, laying it across the chair by the stove. He sat for a long time, staring at the empty chair opposite. Emma's words still haunted him, never letting people in. But now there was a boy on the fence line, and a mare with teeth marks in an apple branch, both pressing gently at the closed doors of his silence. That night he dreamed of the orchard in spring, trees heavy with blossoms, bees humming in the warmth. In the dream, Caleb walked between the rows, laughter bubbling like it once had from Emma as a child. And Ash, no longer gaunt, moved with quiet strength through the orchard, her dark mane catching petals in the breeze. When Hank woke, the dream clung to him like the smell of wood smoke. He pulled on his boots, the morning light spilling pale across the floorboards, and stepped out toward the barn. Ash greeted him with a soft nicker, faint but certain. On the rail, the apple branch still leaned, buds tight, waiting. Hank touched it gently as he passed. He did not need words to understand what it meant. The nights in Vermont were still long, though the edge of winter had begun to dull. Snow no longer fell heavy from the sky, but the crusted drifts melted in slow rivulets, running down the fields toward the river. The ground softened, giving way under boots, releasing the scent of earth that had been buried for months. For Hank, each step across the mud was both a burden and a reminder. Things thaw, whether a man is ready or not. That evening, as the sun drained low and left only a faint copper on the ridge, Hank carried an old leather-bound journal into the barn. It was his wife's, the pages filled with her rounded script, lists of recipes, notes about the cows, half-written thoughts about the weather, and in between, small lines of tenderness she never voiced aloud. He had kept it sealed away for years, unable to read more than a phrase before grief swallowed him whole. But now, with the mare shifting in the stall, he felt an odd urge to let the words breathe again. Ash lifted her head as he entered, ears flicking toward the book in his hands, as if she recognized something in its weight. Hank lowered himself onto the stool, the wood creaking beneath him. He set the journal across his knees, hesitated, then opened it. The smell of old paper and ink filled the air. March 4th, he read, his voice rasping, unused to being stretched. The snow won't give. Hank says the sap will run soon, but I think he's just being hopeful. He doesn't talk much, but I know he feels it in the trees. His voice faltered. He glanced at Ash, who stood still, her dark eyes reflecting the dim light. He cleared his throat, trying again. April 10th. The calves kicked hard this morning. I hummed the song my mother sang, and they settled. Hank doesn't hum, but he split more wood than we'll ever need. That's how he sings. Hank exhaled slowly, the words sinking into the rafters. He had never thought of his work as a song. To him, it had always been survival, necessity. But reading her words aloud, he felt the weight of them wrap around him like a shawl. Ash shifted, taking a step closer. The straw rustled softly. Hank's eyes stayed on the page, but his voice steadied. June 15th. The maples are green as emeralds. Hank stayed out late boiling syrup, hands blistered. I told him to rest. He said, tomorrow's another day for sap. He never says much else, but I know it's his way of caring. Maybe one day Emma will understand. The mare lowered her head slowly, nostrils flaring, her breath clouding in the cool barn air. Hank felt it against his arm, warm and tentative. He didn't move, afraid to break the fragile thread between them. Instead, he turned another page, letting her hear the rhythm of his wife's words. August 2nd. Emma climbed the apple tree today, fell and scraped her knee. Hank carried her inside, said nothing, but cleaned the wound gentler than I've ever seen him do anything. Sometimes I wish he knew how to say what he feels, but then again maybe I'm the only one who needs to hear it. Hank's throat tightened. He looked at Ash, and in her gaze he saw not understanding, but patience. She leaned closer, her muzzle brushing the fabric of his sleeve. The contact was feather light, but it sent a rush through him, the first time in years he felt the warmth of another being choosing him. He lowered the journal, his hand trembling as it hovered near her cheek. Ash didn't pull away. Instead, she exhaled, a long sigh that seemed to empty the barn of its silence. For the first time since his wife's passing, Hank spoke into the space without fear of the echo. "I miss her," he whispered. The words didn't shatter him. They settled, heavy but bearable, softened by the mare's steady presence. Ash's eyes half closed, her breath even. Hank rested his palm lightly against her jaw. The wool blanket still hung on the rail beside them. But tonight he didn't need it. The warmth was real, living, breathing. Later, as the moon climbed and cast pale silver through the cracks of the barn, Hank closed the journal. He sat in the straw until his back ached, listening to Ash's breathing merge with his own. It was not a song, not a prayer, not a promise. It was something quieter and more enduring. The beginning of trust spoken without words, carried on the voice of the past, made alive in the present. The thaw came slowly, but when it did, it changed the air. Buckets that had hung empty for months now filled with sap, clear as glass, dripping steadily from the maples that lined Hank's land. The woods smelled alive again, sweetness hidden under the bark, a promise that winter had finally loosened its grip. Hank carried his pails along the grove, shoulders bent under the weight. Steam rose from the sugar house chimney, where the sap boiled down into syrup, thick and amber. For years, this had been his life. Collect, carry, boil. But this spring felt different. He wasn't alone in the rhythm anymore. Every time he returned to the barn, Ash lifted her head, ears twitching, her gaze steady. Something in her eyes told him the thaw wasn't only in the trees. The town stirred too. In Vermont, the Maple Festival marked the turning of the season, a gathering where neighbors came with fiddles and pies, where families lingered over pancakes soaked in syrup, where children raced across muddy fields. It was one of the few times the whole community gathered, not for work or for need, but simply to mark survival. Hank hadn't attended in years. Since his wife's passing, he avoided crowds, avoided the cheerful noise that felt too sharp against his grief. But this year, when Pastor Miguel stopped by with a flyer in his hand, Hank didn't shut the door as quickly. "You should come," Miguel said gently. "It isn't just for the maple, it's for us, reminding each other we made it through." Hank almost said no. The words lined up on his tongue, heavy with habit. But then he thought of Ash, of the way she had leaned against him while he read from the journal, of Caleb's silent persistence at the fence. Something had shifted, and he wasn't sure he could keep holding it back. The morning of the festival dawned clear, the sky a wide sheet of blue. Hank brushed Ash carefully, combing through the tangles of her mane until it shone with a muted sheen. She stood calmer than she had weeks ago, though her muscles still tensed at sudden sounds. He laid the wool blanket across her back, not for warmth this time, but as a sign she was cared for. Leading her down the road was slow work. She balked at the clatter of a passing truck, shied at the flutter of a plastic bag caught in the ditch. Hank's hand on the lead rope was steady, his voice low and even. Each time she spooked, she looked to him, and each time he waited until her breath slowed. When they reached the square, the air buzzed with sound, fiddles tuning, voices calling, the smell of syrup thick in the air. Heads turned as Hank led Ash toward the edge of the crowd. Whispers rose, not unkind, but curious. Isn't that Whitman? He hasn't come in years. And a horse? Where'd he find that thing? Hank kept his eyes forward, but he felt the weight of their stares. Ash shifted uneasily, her ears flicking. But she didn't bolt. He stood beside her, his hand brushing her neck, grounding them both. Near the sugar stand, Emma appeared. Her hair was pulled back, her coat neat against the chill. She hadn't told him she was coming, but then again, she rarely told him anything anymore. Her eyes widened slightly when she saw the mare. For a moment, Hank thought she might turn away. Instead, she walked closer, her voice low, but edged with disbelief. "You brought her here?" Hank nodded. "She's strong enough now." Emma studied the horse, her gaze softening despite herself. Ash lowered her head slightly, as if recognizing the gentleness in Emma's stance. The sight caught Hank off guard. His daughter, who had accused him of never letting people in, standing inches from the creature who had become his only companion. The fiddles struck up, children danced, laughter rolled through the crowd, yet Hank heard none of it. His world narrowed to the space between his daughter, the mare, and himself. Ash flicked her ears back as a gust of wind carried the sweet smoke of boiling syrup. Hank reached up, his hand steady on her neck, his voice barely audible. "Easy." And she stilled. Emma saw it, the quiet trust, the way the animal leaned into him rather than away. Something shifted in her expression, a crack in the wall she had built since her mother's death. She didn't say anything, but she didn't turn away either. As the sun dipped low, the townsfolk's curiosity turned into quiet murmurs of approval. A few children asked if they could pet the mare, but Hank shook his head gently. Not yet. Not until Ash chose. By the time he led her back home, the air was cooling, the road soft with mud. Ash walked beside him more steadily than before, her steps matching his. Behind them, the square still hummed with life. Ahead, the farm waited, no longer as empty as it had once been. That night, as he folded the blanket over the rail, Hank felt the echo of the day settle inside him. He had brought Ash into the world he had avoided for years, and she had not broken under its noise. Neither had he. For the first time since his wife's passing, Hank realized he had stood among his neighbors without shrinking. And when he closed his eyes, he saw not just the mare, but Emma's gaze softening in the light of the maple fire. The Maple Festival had ended with laughter and music still echoing in Hank's ears, though he hadn't joined in the dancing or the long tables of pancakes. He had stood quietly at the edge, one hand steady on Ash's neck, letting her take in the world she had been denied for so long. For the first time in years, he felt the murmur of community brush against him, tentative, but warm. But spring in Vermont was never gentle. Days after the festival, the sky turned iron gray, and a storm rolled down from the hills. Rain froze on contact, coating branches in glass. The maples bent under the weight, creaking like old bones. Hank laid logs on the fire, the crackle inside the stove drowned by the relentless hiss of ice against the windows. In the barn, Ash stood restless, stamping her hooves against the straw. The storm rattled the boards, wind seeping through cracks like icy knives. Hank stayed with her, lantern light trembling on the walls. He spoke little, only small reassurances as he checked her water, her feed, her blanket. But by morning, he heard it. The rasp in her chest, a cough tearing through the still air. It was not the sound of dust or straw. It was deeper, harsher, the kind that turned Hank's stomach cold. He pressed a hand to her neck, feeling the tremors ripple through muscle and bone. Ash shivered, her eyes dull, head low. Panic pressed against his ribs, but he swallowed it down. He knew panic served no one. Not man, not horse. He pulled the blanket tighter around her and whispered, "Hold on, girl. Just hold on." The vet's number blurred in his mind. He hadn't called in years, not since the last cow had died, not since he'd given up keeping livestock. But his fingers found the phone, stiff with hesitation. When the vet answered, her voice was calm but urgent. Medicine, tests, a visit to the clinic if things worsened. The cost landed heavy. Hank listened, nodded, and when he set the phone down, he knew what it meant. Money he didn't have, taxes already hanging over him like low branches ready to snap. He sat at the table, staring at the ledger book, the unpaid bills tucked between pages. His hands clenched, then opened. By dusk, he was at the shed, pulling out the old maple drill. The tool had been with him for decades, steel worn smooth by use. He stared at it for a long time before loading it into the back of the truck. At the farm supply store, he set it on the counter, his chest tight. The clerk raised an eyebrow, but said nothing, as Hank accepted the cash, folded it into his pocket. That night, under the hiss of freezing rain, he handed the money to the vet. She came through the storm with her bag, her breath clouding in the cold. Ash's sides heaved, but the medicine steadied her, slow and sure. Hank stood in the shadows, watching the mare's chest rise and fall, each breath a fragile victory. When the vet left, Hank remained in the barn. He spread fresh straw, his back aching, his fingers numb. He thought of the drill, of the years he had spent tapping trees, of the syrup his wife had poured into jars labeled with neat handwriting. Giving it up felt like giving away part of her. But when Ash lifted her head, eyes clearing just slightly, he knew the choice was already made. Through the night he kept vigil, lantern flickering, rain hammering the roof. Emma called once, her voice sharp with worry when she heard the strain in his tone. "Dad, you can't do this alone," she said. "I'm not alone," Hank answered before he could stop himself. His eyes never left the mare. She didn't reply, but after a long silence, she whispered, "I'll come when I can." Then the line went dead. By dawn, the storm broke. The ice began to melt, dripping from the eaves in silver threads. Ash stood weak, but breathing easier, her body still thin, but her eyes less clouded. Hank reached through the stall, pressing his palm against her neck. This time, she leaned into him, steady and sure. He closed his eyes, letting the weight of the moment sink into his bones. Sacrifice had always been part of his life. Work for the trees, for the land, for the family he'd lost. But tonight, for the first time, he realized sacrifice could also be love, not just labor. Outside, branches cracked as the thaw began, the sound sharp but clean. Hank stayed in the barn until the light spread gold across the hills, until the cough quieted, until he believed that spring might still come for both of them. The storm had passed, but the ground still carried its wounds. Branches lay broken across the fields, shards of ice glittered in the ditches, and the air smelled of wet bark. Ash was still weak, though her breathing had steadied. Hank stayed near her, through the day, laying fresh hay, carrying buckets of water, speaking to her in the low tones he rarely used with people. Each time her eyes met his, he felt a quiet reassurance. She was still here, still fighting. By late afternoon, dark clouds rolled back over the ridge. The forecast had promised only drizzle, but Vermont skies were never predictable. Hank stood on the porch, watching the horizon thicken. The first drops fell with a soft hiss, soaking into the earth. Then the rain came harder, beating against the tin roof, dripping from the gutters in heavy streams. He was about to head back to the barn when headlights flared against the wet gravel drive. A small car pulled in, wipers thrashing. The door opened, and Emma stepped out, pulling her coat tight around her. The rain plastered strands of hair to her face as she hurried up the steps. "You didn't tell me how bad it was," she said, her voice raised over the downpour. Hank blinked, caught between surprise and fatigue. "She's holding on. That's enough." Emma dropped her bag on the porch, anger flashing through her exhaustion. "You sold your tools, didn't you? I called the store. They told me." Hank's jaw tightened. He looked away, out at the rain streaking across the yard. "It had to be done." Her voice cracked, sharp as the thunder rolling in the distance. "You always do this. Throw yourself into saving something else because you can't face what's right in front of you. Mom needed you, and you hid in the woods. Now this horse, is it just another excuse?" The words landed heavier than the storm. Hank felt them settle in his chest, pressing against years of silence he had built like a dam. He turned back, rain dripping from the brim of his cap, his eyes hollow but steady. "I wasn't hiding," he said, his voice low but firm. "I was afraid. Every time I looked at her, I saw what I couldn't fix. I chopped wood because it was something I could split. I boiled sap because it was something I could hold in a jar, but I couldn't stop her from leaving me." Emma's lips parted, but no words came. Rain streaked her cheeks, mixing with tears she wouldn't admit. "I was scared to look at you too," Hank continued, "because you've got her eyes. And if I opened my mouth, I thought I'd break apart." The porch creaked under the weight of their silence. For years they had circled each other with blame and grief, never colliding, never confessing. Now the storm had cornered them, forced the truth out like sap from a wounded tree. Emma's shoulders slumped. Her voice, when it came, was softer, almost pleading. "I didn't need you to fix it, Dad. I just needed you to sit at the table, to look at me, to let me hurt with you." The rain hammered harder, running in rivers off the roof. Hank reached for the railing, his knuckles white. He wanted to answer, but the words tangled. At last, he said the only thing that felt true. "I'm sorry. It wasn't enough. It couldn't undo the years of silence. But it was real, and it was more than he had ever managed to say." Emma stepped forward, her coat dripping, her eyes searching his face. For the first time since her mother's death, she saw the fracture lines in her father's armor. Not stubbornness, but fear. She reached out, placing her hand briefly on his arm. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was a start. From the barn came a soft sound, a nicker carried on the rein. Both turned toward it. Ash's head appeared just beyond the stall window, her breath rising in the damp air. The mare watched them quietly, as if she too understood the fragile bridge being built in that storm. Emma exhaled, her voice barely above the rain. "Let's go see her." Hank nodded. Together they crossed the yard, the mud sucking at their boots, the storm pouring down. For the first time in years, father and daughter moved side by side, bound not by words, but by the fragile presence of a horse who had asked for nothing, yet given them both a reason to speak. Rain still threaded from the gutters when Hank and Emma stepped into the barn. The lantern threw a warm circle across the stall. Within it, Ash lifted her head and blew a soft breath, as if greeting them both. Emma stood quietly at the rail, palms open, the way someone approaches a skittish thing they don't want to frighten. Hank watched his daughter and the horse share the same small silence, felt something in him unclench, a hinge oiled by nothing more than presence. "Hey, girl," Emma murmured. "You gave him a scare." Ash's ears tilted toward the voice. Hank set a fresh flake of hay down and checked the water bucket. The cough had eased. What remained was a tiredness that matched the weather. He glanced at Emma, wanting to say, "I'm glad you came," but the words snagged, tender and untested. Instead, he touched the rail, as if the wood could carry the message. By morning, the sky was washed pale. The storm had torn limbs from the maples and strewn them across the pasture. A damp hush lay over everything, interrupted only by the drip of meltwater and the distant rush of the river. Hank and Emma worked side by side, clearing branches, stacking them near the fence for later cutting. It felt strange and right at once, two people used to moving alone, moving in tandem. Near noon, the first sound came, thin, high, and jagged as glass. Hank froze, head lifted, listening. The cry came again from the north ridge, beyond the sugar house. Not a fox, not a hawk, a child. The sound went through him like a jolt. "Caleb," Emma said, already turning. The boy's house sat past the stand of spruce. His mother had mentioned he liked to walk the boundary after storms, counting broken boughs, keeping the world neat in his way since the night wind peeled shingles from their roof. The family had fought with their home insurance last year, a knot of adjusters and forms and waiting, and the town had patched the rest. Since then, Caleb drifted the fence lines like a thin ghost keeping tally. Another cry, closer to a keening this time. Hank ran. Years dropped from his stride as he cut across the field toward the maple grove, mud sucking at his boots. Emma followed, breath quick, hair coming loose from its tie. The path narrowed under the trees where ice had welded small branches into lattices that now broke with each step, tinkling like glass ornaments falling one by one. At the far edge of the grove, a maple had split clean at the crotch and fallen, its crown caught in a snarl of saplings. Beneath it, a small figure crouched in a pocket of space, arms wrapped over his head. Caleb. The tree didn't pin him, but it caged him in a chaos of limbs and ice, the wind knocking the loosened crown so that wand-like branches scraped and clacked above him. His eyes were wide and far away, that live-wire gaze Hank knew too well, the look of a mind leaving its body to escape the noise. "It's okay," Emma said, palms out. "Caleb, can you hear me?" No answer. The boy rocked, breath hiccuping, soundless now, the kind of panic that turns everything inward. The crown shifted again with a groan. Hank took a step into the tangle and felt the whole mess shiver. He backed out slow. "We pull wrong, the crown settles," he said, voice low. "We need a lever, or a team." "Pastor Miguel's got folks with ropes," Emma said. She moved away to get a signal. The reception was poor. Her voice broke up against the cold air. "I can't get him." Then from the direction of the barn came the quick staccato of hooves. Hank turned. Ash had broken the half-set latch on the paddock gate and was trotting along the path they'd carved through the field, head high, ears forward. She halted at the edge of the grove, sides heaving, eyes fixed on the boy inside the bramble of branches. "How?" Emma began. Hank didn't answer. He didn't know either. Only that some thread had run from Caleb's cry through the trees into the dark of the barn and tugged at the same place in ash that had once flickered in her eyes the day nobody lifted a bid card. He moved to her side, palm against the hot arch of her neck. "Easy, girl." He could feel her trembling, not with illness now, but with decision, as if standing on a ledge between flight and something braver. The wind teased the mane along her crest. Caleb made a small sound, half whimper, half breath, and Ash stepped forward. The tangle was too tight for a man to crawl in without bringing the whole crown down. But a horse's body could wedge and brace where human hands would only rattle. Hank guided Ash to the angle where two limbs crossed like scissors. She lowered her head, nostrils working, and blew a soft stream of breath into the little hollow where Caleb crouched. The boy's rocking slowed a fraction. He blinked, focused on the dark eye inches from him. "That's it," Hank whispered. "She's with you." Emma knelt at the opening, keeping her voice like warm water. "Caleb, touch her if you can." She didn't say, "It will ground you." She didn't say, "Breathe with her." She let the body teach what words couldn't. Ash shifted, setting her shoulder against a bough. Hank slid the rope he'd carried under one limb, looped it, and braced. "On my voice, girl," he said, as if she knew the language. Maybe she knew the tone. He leaned, rope biting his palm. Ash pushed. The limb lifted enough to open a seam of light above the boy. "Come on," Emma breathed. "That's it. Come." Her hand hovered, an invitation that did not demand. Caleb reached out, not to her, not yet, but to Ash. He laid his palm against the mare's cheek, as if it were the only solid thing in the world. There was a pause so complete Hank could hear droplets ticking from branch to branch. Then the boy moved. One knee, then the other. Ash held the brace. Hank kept the rope tight. Emma guided without pulling. When Caleb finally wriggled free, the crown slid with a thud into the place his body had been. He stumbled, then pitched forward against Ash's shoulder, arms flung around her neck. The mare took the weight without flinching. She lifted her head just enough to shelter him from the drip and the weak wind that still moved among the broken leaves. The three of them, boy, horse, man, stood there inside a silence so tender it felt like the first true sound of spring. Emma's breath shuddered out. She touched the boy's back, then glanced at her father. In his face, she saw not the old stone of avoidance, but something open and raw that matched her own. Caleb didn't speak. He didn't need to. His cheek pressed against Ash's coat, the rise and fall of her breath drawing his own into rhythm. Hank felt the exchange like a physical thing, the way a body lends steadiness to another without a single instruction. At length, the boy loosened his grip. He looked up at Hank, then at Emma, eyes clearer. "Let's get you warm," Emma said. She shrugged out of her coat and put it over his shoulders. "Your mom's going to be worried sick." The boy nodded once, as if the motion had to pass through a distance to reach him. They walked out of the grove together. Hank led Ash slow, keeping the rope loose. Caleb kept his hand on her withers, the way a swimmer keeps fingers on the dock even after finding footing. At the pasture fence, they paused while Emma called Pastor Miguel. Reception held. "We've got him," she said simply. "Yes, he's okay." At the road, Caleb's mother came running, relief nearly dropping her to her knees. Words tumbled, "Thank you, thank you," and then faded to quiet sobs as she pulled the boy to her. He leaned into the hug without the rigidness Hank had seen before, as if part of the ice in him had finally cracked. Pastor Miguel arrived with a pickup of volunteers, ropes coiled, saws in the bed. He took in the scene, the fallen crown, the mare standing calm with mud to her fetlocks, the old farmer and his daughter side by side. Something in his smile said he'd been waiting for this picture long before any of them knew it would form. "You did good," he told Caleb first. Then he looked at Ash. "And you." To Hank and Emma, a nod that carried more than words. Community, not casework. Care, not liability. In another town, someone might have argued about risk or called an attorney. Here, people reached for rope and warm blankets. Back at the barn, Hank rubbed Ash down, working the water from her coat with a towel warmed by the stove. She stood quiet, eyes half closed, the edges of her fear rounded by use. Emma filled a bucket and checked the blanket's straps. When she finished, she leaned her forehead to Ash's, just for a breath. The mare didn't move. "Dad," Emma said, straightening. She looked younger and older all at once, rain clean and tired. "You heard him before I did." Hank shook his head. "I heard what I've been hearing for a long time. I just didn't know where to go with it." He set his palm against Ash's neck. She knew. Emma studied his face, then the horse's. "Then maybe you both did." Evening gathered with a gentler hand than the night before. The clouds lifted a little, letting a thin stripe of amber lay itself across the pasture. Caleb's mother texted Emma, a photo of the boy under a quilt, a mug of cocoa on the table. "He keeps saying the horse is warm," the message read. "He slept for the first time in weeks." Hank traced the metal buckle of the halter, the way one might study the clasp of a locket. "Tomorrow I'll mend the paddock latch," he said, though he wasn't sure he wanted to. The break had let something true happen. Emma smiled, small and unguarded. "Leave it one more day," she said, "just in case someone else needs to find their way out." They stood together, listening to Ash graze at the last of her hay, the soft rasp steady as a heartbeat. Outside, the drip from the eaves slowed. Inside, the air warmed from more than the lantern light. The day had carved something new into the barn's old wood. An invisible mark, like the rings inside a tree proving survival year over year. Before Emma turned in, she paused at the stall door. "Thank you," she said, not specifying for what. Caleb, the confession, the way Hank had stepped when she stepped. He started to say, "You're welcome," but settled for a nod that meant more. Words like sap would come in their time. When the lamp was down and the yard went dark, Hank rested his arm across the rail. Ash shifted toward him and let her chin settle near his wrist. A weight that said, "Stay." He stayed. In the hush, he remembered the pastor's line about sweetness running in more than trees. He believed it a little now, not because anyone preached it, but because a boy's cry had carried through wet woods and pulled a horse and two people into the same clearing. He whispered into her mane, the way a man talks to the one creature that will never judge the grammar of his heart. "Good girl." The wind moved once through the maples, a long, low breath. No storm in it, only the sound of branches learning again how to lift their own weight. The woods were quiet again after the rescue, but the hush carried a different weight, less fear, more reverence. Hank couldn't shake the image of Caleb's thin arms wrapped around Ash's neck, the way the boy's trembling had slowed to the rhythm of her breathing. That moment had settled deep inside him, a reminder that sometimes the smallest act of steadiness could turn a storm. In the days that followed, neighbors stopped by more often. Some came with casseroles for Caleb's family, others with rope and saws to clear the rest of the fallen trees. The talk in town carried a new note, not about the horse's weakness or the old farmer's solitude, but about the night both had stepped forward when it mattered most. Hank wasn't used to company. For years, the porch light had burned to an empty yard. Now boots scuffed across it, voices carried through the kitchen walls, laughter rising even when he stayed silent. He found himself listening, not turning them away. Emma noticed, though she said nothing. Just a faint smile whenever she caught him pausing at the doorframe, leaning against it longer than before. Ash grew stronger with each morning. Her coat filled, her cough vanished, and the hollowness around her eyes began to soften. Yet she remained watchful, cautious of sudden sounds. Hank kept his patience. He knew trust was a season, not a moment. One evening, as the sun folded into the hills, Emma suggested something unexpected. They were in the barn, the lantern casting wide shadows across the beams. Ash was chewing hay, the sound steady as a metronome. "Dad," Emma said, brushing straw from her sleeve, "what if we didn't keep her hidden here anymore? What if the town could come to her?" Hank frowned, uncertain. "What do you mean?" "Caleb, the way he changed when he touched her. Others could use that too. Kids, even grown-ups. People who carry things they don't talk about." Her gaze held his. "You know what that feels like." The idea stirred something in him, half fear, half hope. "She's not ready for crowds." "Not crowds," Emma said gently. "Just a circle. A quiet one. A place where people can stand with her, the way we do." Hank thought of the maple grove, the buckets gleaming like lanterns when the sun struck them. He thought of the boy's mother sending that message. He keeps saying the horse is warm. Slowly, he nodded. Maybe. Word spread faster than he expected. Not by flyers or calls, but by whispers at the diner, a nod at church, a mention at the supply store. Within a week, neighbors began arriving at dusk, one or two at a time, drawn by something they couldn't quite name. They gathered in the barn, forming a circle around the stall. Ash stood in the center, her head lowered, eyes calm but alert. No one spoke much. They didn't need to. The circle itself was enough. Boots scuffing the dirt, breaths rising in the lantern glow, the soft sound of a horse shifting her weight. People placed their hands on the rail. some reaching out when Ash leaned near, others only watching. Caleb was always there, small hand steady on her neck. The boy no longer hid behind sleeves. He spoke in whispers now, not to people, but to the mare, and she answered in sighs. Pastor Miguel came one evening and simply said, "This is prayer enough." No one argued. For Hank, it was both strange and humbling. The barn that had once been a tomb of silence now hummed with life, yet never in noise. The circle kept its peace. People arrived burdened, left lighter, though no one claimed a cure. Emma called it Ash Hour. She painted the name on a rough board and nailed it above the door. Hank didn't stop her. He even found himself touching the sign once in a while as he passed beneath it, like checking the pulse of something alive. One night, after the last neighbor had gone and the lanterns were dimmed, Hank lingered in the barn. Ash stepped close, pressing her head against his chest. He rested a hand on her mane, feeling the heat of her trust. "You've done more for them than I ever could," he whispered. Ash flicked her ears, as if listening. The barn smelled of hay and cedar, warm against the cool spring air. For the first time, Hank realized the circle had done as much for him as for anyone else. It had opened the walls he'd built, let light pour through cracks he thought were permanent. Emma entered quietly, carrying 2 mugs of tea. She handed one to him, leaned against the rail. Together, they watched Ash breathe, steady and sure. "She's healing us too," Emma said softly. Hank didn't answer right away. He thought of the years of silence, the weight he had carried like an anchor. He thought of his wife's words in the journal, of the storm, of Caleb's hand pressed against the mare's cheek. Finally, he said, "Maybe that's what she was waiting for. Not just a home, a circle." The night deepened. The only sound the quiet rustle of hay and the drip of meltwater beyond the door. And for once, Hank didn't feel the need to fill it with work or words. The circle had already spoken. Spring had finally taken hold of Vermont. Snow lingered only in shaded ditches, shrinking each day into small, dirty mounds. The maples flushed with pale green buds, and the air smelled of wet earth and new grass. Hank stood at the edge of the barnyard one morning and realized he hadn't felt the press of winter's silence in weeks. The barn no longer seemed like a place for hiding grief. It had become a doorway, open and waiting. Word of Ash Hour spread in the way good things always do. Quiet, steady, through whispers rather than proclamations. People came not only from their town, but from nearby villages. Mothers brought children who hadn't spoken in months. Fathers came carrying burdens of lost jobs. Neighbors shuffled in with nothing but the need to stand in that circle. Each left with something lighter. Emma, watching it grow, said one evening, "They need something more. Something that belongs to all of us, not just the barn." Hank looked up from brushing Ash's coat. "What do you mean?" "A walk. Through the square. Nothing loud. Just us, following her, like a ribbon pulling us together." Hank hesitated. The barn was one thing, contained, familiar. The square was another. Faces, questions, the chance of breaking what was fragile. But he saw the determination in Emma's eyes, and behind it, a spark of his wife's way of turning grief into gathering. When the day came, the sky was soft with spring haze. The townsfolk assembled slowly, uncertain at first. Caleb held a bundle of cloth strips, each marked with handwriting. Thank yous, prayers, regrets, hopes. Emma had asked everyone to write one line, tie their voice into something the horse could carry. Hank stood by Ash, his hand steady on her lead. She shifted, but did not shy from the crowd. Emma stepped forward and tied the first strip into Ash's mane, the fabric pale blue against dark hair. Then Caleb tied another, his small fingers trembling as he knotted it tight. One by one, others followed, until her mane fluttered with colors, yellow, green, white, every scrap of fabric carrying the weight of words too hard to say aloud. The fiddles and drums of the Maple Festival were absent. No one called out. The walk began in silence, the kind that felt chosen rather than empty. Hank led Ash slowly through the square, Emma at his side, Caleb holding the rope with both hands. Behind them, the townsfolk fell in step, boots scuffing against the thawed ground, breath rising in rhythm. Shops along the street quieted. A man setting out crates of produce paused, hat in hand. A woman at the cafe door pressed a napkin to her eyes. Even drivers pulled over, headlights dimmed as the line of people passed. Hank kept his eyes forward, listening not to the silence, but to what lived inside it. The sound of grief given space, of hearts admitting they still beat despite loss. Each time the strips in Ash's mane rustled, he imagined the words brushing against each other, stories weaving without ever being spoken. At the square's center, they circled once around the old maple tree, its trunk scarred by years of tapping. Hank felt Emma's shoulder touch his as they paused. Ash lowered her head, mane stirring with its ribbons, and the circle tightened around her. People wept openly now, not from spectacle, but from release. Pastor Miguel stepped forward only to say, "She carries us. That's enough." His voice broke, and he let the silence close again. The walk ended where it began, back at the barn. No one rushed to leave. They lingered, laying hands on the wood rails, letting their fingers rest on Ash's flank if she allowed it. She accepted more than Hank ever expected. Mothers, children, even the old men who had muttered at the auction weeks ago. When the last of the townsfolk drifted away, Emma leaned against the barn door, tears still wet on her cheeks. "Did you see them?" she asked, voice trembling. Hank nodded. "I saw." Caleb, still clutching the rope, looked up at Hank with wide eyes. "She didn't get scared," he said softly, pride swelling his thin chest. "No," Hank agreed, laying a hand on the boy's shoulder. "She didn't." Ash stood quiet, mane heavy with cloth, the barn light painting her in gold. Hank touched one strip at random. It read, "Thank you for reminding me I'm not alone." He swallowed hard, unable to speak. The words pressed against him like a balm and a burden both. For years he had thought silence was safer, but today the silence had carried more than he ever could have managed alone. That night, long after Emma and Caleb had gone inside, Hank remained in the barn. He sat on the stool, the ribbons whispering each time Ash moved. He thought of the boy rescued in the woods, the storm on the porch, the illness that nearly stole her. All of it had led here, to this quiet parade that had stitched a fractured town together. When Ash finally lowered her head onto his shoulder, he closed his eyes. For the first time, he let himself believe that healing wasn't something to chase, but something that came when you dared to walk in step with others, even if the steps were slow, even if the silence was all you had. The morning after the silent parade, the town still carried its echo. Shopkeepers spoke in softer voices, Children lingered longer at windows, and the church bell, when it rang, seemed to vibrate deeper than before. Something had shifted. An invisible seam in the fabric of Sheffield had been stitched, not by speeches or rules, but by the steady steps of a horse and the willingness of people to walk together in silence. Hank felt it most in the stillness of his kitchen. The old room, once heavy with absence, now bore the warmth of movement. Emma had stayed overnight, her bag propped by the door, her coat slung on the chair her mother used to favor. Caleb had been dropped off early by his mother, who whispered her thanks before hurrying to work, leaving the boy bundled in his jacket on the porch. Inside, Hank set batter on the griddle. The hiss of pancakes rising filled the air, mingling with the sweet steam of maple syrup simmering on the stove. For years, breakfast had been a solitary ritual. Burnt toast, black coffee, silence, stretching long. Now the table held 3 plates, forks stacked, mugs warming by the fire. Emma moved easily in the space, her hands tidying, her eyes softer than he remembered. She poured juice into glasses without asking where things belonged, as if she had always known. Caleb sat at the table, shoulders still small but less hunched, watching the window with a quiet expectancy. Through the glass, Ash's silhouette filled the barn doorway. She stood calmly, her mane still threaded with a few of the ribbons from the day before. Faded now, but no less bright in meaning. Her breath fogged the air, slow and even. Each time Caleb looked out, his lips curved into something between awe and relief, as if the mare's presence anchored him. "Dad?" Emma said, as she slid the syrup jug onto the table. "She's watching us." Hank glanced at the window. "She always does." His voice carried no bitterness, only a tired warmth, the tone of someone who has lived enough to know the value of eyes that do not turn away. They sat together, plates filled, forks scraping gently against china. Caleb ate cautiously at first, then with more hunger, syrup dripping down his chin. Emma laughed, an unguarded sound that filled the kitchen in a way Hank had not heard since his wife. The laugh startled him, then eased him, as if the walls themselves were grateful. Halfway through the meal, Caleb set down his fork. "She saved me," he said, voice quiet but sure. His eyes stayed on the window, where Ash shifted slightly, ears flicking. "I thought I was stuck forever. But then, she was just there." Emma reached over and squeezed his hand. Hank swallowed the lump in his throat, staring at the plate as if the shape of the pancakes could steady him. Finally, he said, "Sometimes that's all it takes. Someone showing up." The boy nodded. Silence settled, not heavy this time, but companionable. The kind of silence that leaves room for breathing. After breakfast, Hank stepped outside with Caleb. The yard smelled of thawed mud and wood smoke. Ash lowered her head as they approached, her breath brushing Caleb's hair. He reached up, fingers running through her mane, finding one of the ribbons still tied. The cloth was damp from dew, the ink slightly blurred but legible. "For the ones we've lost, may we carry them forward." Caleb held the ribbon, then looked at Hank. "Can we keep it?" Hank nodded. "It's yours." The boy tucked it carefully into his jacket pocket, like a secret talisman. Ash nickered softly, leaning her weight against Hank's side. He steadied her without thought, hand firm on her neck. The contact was no longer tentative, no longer uncertain. It was simply the language they had learned together. Later, when Emma joined them, she carried 2 mugs of coffee. She handed one to Hank, wrapped both hands around her own, and watched the horizon. The maples stretched tall against the sky, their buds breaking, the season shifting without permission. "Do you think Mom would have liked this?" she asked quietly. Hank didn't answer right away. He looked at his daughter, at the boy standing close to the horse, at the ribbons still catching in the breeze. Then he said, "She would have loved it, all of 'em. His voice cracked, but he let it stand. Emma leaned her head briefly against his shoulder. It wasn't forgiveness spoken, but forgiveness lived. By evening, the house smelled of syrup again. Hank poured it over the last stack of pancakes and placed them in the center of the table. He didn't care if it was supper instead of breakfast. Some meals mattered less for the hour and more for the company. Emma and Caleb laughed at the oddness of it, and Hank found himself laughing too. The sound rusty, but real. Through the open barn door, Ash lifted her head at the sound of their voices. She didn't come forward. She didn't need to. It was enough to know she was there, holding the same air, the same space, the same fragile but growing trust that now stretched not just between man and horse, but across a table, into a family, and out toward a town learning how to be whole again. Spring mornings in Vermont carried a brightness that almost felt undeserved after the weight of winter. The frost was gone now, replaced by dew that sparkled along the grass. Buckets still clung to the maples, though their steady drip had slowed. What remained was sweeter, thicker, as if the trees themselves knew the season was giving its last gift. On this morning, the town gathered again. Not for an auction, not for labor, not even for the silent circle in the barn, but for something gentler. A procession had been planned, not by decree, but by desire. Word had spread through kitchens and cafes, down gravel lanes and across the church pews. One more walk, one more moment of being together before spring tipped fully into summer. Hank rose early. He brushed Ash's coat until it gleamed, the winter dullness gone. Her mane still carried a few ribbons, frayed by weather, their ink faded but not forgotten. Emma helped braid fresh strips of cloth, each one bearing words written in careful script. Caleb had spent the evening gathering them, neighbors stopping by with slips of fabric, folded notes, handkerchief corners inked with gratitude. By the time they led Ash toward the square, the town was waiting. No fiddles this time, no clamor, just people holding one another's presence with the same reverence they had learned in the barn. Children stood on tiptoe, eyes wide, as the mayor approached. Old men removed their hats. Women pressed their palms together, tears already shining. Emma tied the last strip herself, a piece of her mother's old apron. She didn't say what she had written, but Hank saw her hand linger on the knot, her breath catch. When she stepped back, her eyes met his. For once, there was no accusation there, only a quiet understanding that needed no words. The walk began at the edge of the square. Hank led slowly, Caleb at his side, Emma close behind. Ash stepped steady, each hoofbeat like a drum against the earth, though no sound of music followed. The ribbons lifted and fell in the breeze, carrying their messages like whispers. For the ones we miss, for the strength to begin again, for the sweetness in sorrow. The townsfolk followed, forming a line that curved around the square. The air was hushed but not heavy. It felt alive, threaded with something close to hope. As Ash passed, people reached out, not to clutch, but to brush the air near her flank, as if acknowledging without taking. At the square's center stood the old maple tree. Its bark was scarred from decades of tapping, but its crown still stretched wide, heavy with new leaves. The procession slowed, circling the tree once, then pausing. Hank placed his hand against the trunk, rough beneath his palm, steady as time itself. Emma whispered, "She's carrying them." Hank looked at Ash, her mane alive with colors, fabric strips fluttering like prayer flags. She stood tall, chest deep, ears relaxed, as if she understood the weight she bore was not burden, but offering. Around them, people began to cry, not from spectacle, but from release. Shoulders shook, hands trembled, breaths broke into sobs that echoed off the storefronts. It was not a grief that crushed, but one that cleansed, pulled out into the open where it could no longer rot in silence. Pastor Miguel stepped forward, not to preach, but to place a hand gently on Ash's neck. His eyes glistened. "Thank you," he said simply, to horse, to farmer, to daughter, to town. When the circle broke, no one hurried home. They lingered, touching the ribbons, letting the words brush their skin. Caleb stood close to Ash, his face unguarded, his smile small, but unbroken. For the first time in months, the boy looked like a child rather than a shadow. As the crowd thinned, Hank remained by the tree. He felt Emma step beside him, her hand brushing his. Neither spoke. They didn't need to. The sound of Ash's steady breath was enough. When the last neighbor had gone, Hank untied one ribbon at random. He unfolded it slowly, the ink smudged but legible. "For those who believe we are not alone, even when we feel it most." He held it, letting the words sink. For years he had believed he was the only one left carrying silence, the only one too afraid to open his mouth. Now he knew better. Silence shared was not silence at all. It was something else. Something like healing. As dusk settled, the square glowed with lantern light. Ash lowered her head, resting it briefly against Hank's chest. He closed his eyes, steadying himself against her weight. Emma placed her hand on his back. Caleb leaned against his side. Together they stood. 3 lives stitched by loss, bound now by something stronger. The maple leaves rustled above, catching the lantern glow, shimmering like coins dropped into the night. Morning came slow, with light spilling across the kitchen like honey poured from a jar. The stormed earth had dried, the square was quiet, and the maple buckets along the grove gave their last drops. Hank stood by the stove, watching sap simmer down into syrup. The sweet smell curled through the house, thick and golden, rising like memory itself. The kitchen table was set with 3 plates. Emma moved between stove and counter, sleeves rolled, hair pulled back the way her mother used to when cooking. Caleb sat at the table, chin propped in his hands, watching with quiet anticipation. For him, this was not just breakfast. It was belonging, served hot on a plate. Hank poured the syrup slow, watching it glisten as it slid into a pitcher. He carried it to the table, the steam rising in curls, the smell filling every corner of the room. Emma laid down pancakes, thick and soft, their edges crisp from the griddle. Caleb's eyes widened, his smile shy but certain. Outside, Ash's silhouette appeared at the barn window, breath fogging against the glass. She stood watching, her mane still tangled with a few ribbons that no one had bothered to remove. The fabric moved lightly in the breeze, faded but unbroken, like echoes of all the words she had carried. They ate together without hurry. Syrup dripped down forks, laughter rose between bites, and the old kitchen felt young again. Caleb told a story in fragments, about the tree in the woods, about the sound of Ash's breath steadying his own. Emma listened closely, filling in his pauses with nods and smiles. Hank sat in the quiet of it, letting the warmth seep in like sunlight through frost. When the plates were cleared, Hank opened the door to the barn. The morning air was cool, but no longer biting. Ash stepped forward, ears flicking, eyes soft. Hank reached out, and she pressed her head against his shoulder, the familiar weight grounding him. Emma joined, resting her hand along the mare's neck. Caleb stood close, slipping the ribbon from his pocket, the one he had kept since the woods. He tied it back into her mane, his small fingers working the knot as carefully as if it were a prayer. They lingered there together, not speaking, letting the silence say what words could not. The barn smelled of hay and cedar, the house of syrup, the air of damp earth ready for planting. It was a silence that no longer ached. It breathed. That evening, when the chores were done and Emma had settled Caleb with a book, Hank sat alone at the table with his wife's journal. The lamplight spread warm across the pages, the ink faded but clear. He turned to the last blank sheet and set down his pen. For a long moment he stared at the empty space, the silence pressing in. Then he wrote slowly, his hand unsteady but firm. There is a sweetness that runs in the heart, same as in the trees. I thought it had left when she did. But it only waited for a horse no one wanted, for a boy who still believed in holding on, for a daughter who dared come back. The winter has gone. The sap runs again, and He paused, pen hovering, eyes stinging. Then he finished, I am still here. He closed the book gently, slid it back onto the shelf. Outside, he heard Ash shift in the stall, the sound steady as a breath, and leaned back in his chair, letting the quiet surround him, not as an enemy, but as company. The lantern flickered low, and the maple trees outside whispered in the night wind. Their branches swayed, their roots deep, their sap running sweet beneath the bark. For the first time in years, Hank Whitman did not fear the silence. He welcomed it. Because inside that silence, there was life again. If this story touched your heart, leave a simple comment below. Just a 0 or 1 is enough to let me know you're here with us. Every little mark tells me these stories still matter, that kindness still has a place. Don't forget to subscribe, because there are many more stories of people and animals waiting to be told. Stories that might be the one you need tomorrow.